Section 13 of The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. Chapter 7. Low Spirits, Anxiety, Grief, Dejection, Despair. Part 1. After the mind has suffered from an acute paroxysm of grief, and the cause still continues, we fall into a state of low spirits, or we may be utterly cast down and dejected. Prolonged bodily pain, if not amounting to an agony, generally leads to the same state of mind. If we expect to suffer, we are anxious. If we have no hope of relief, we despair. Persons suffering from excessive grief often seek relief by violent and almost frantic movements, as described in a former chapter. But when their suffering is somewhat mitigated, yet prolonged, they no longer wish for action, but remain motionless and passive, or may occasionally rock themselves to and fro. The circulation becomes languid, the face pale, the muscles flaccid, the eyelids droop, the head hangs on the contracted chest, the lips, cheeks, and lower jaw all sink downwards from their own weight. Hence all the features are lengthened, and the face of the person who hears bad news is said to fall. A party of natives in Tierra del Fuego endeavour to explain to us that their friend, the captain of a sealing vessel, was out of spirits, by pulling down their cheeks with both hands, so as to make their faces as long as possible. Mr. Bunnet informs me that the Australian aborigines, when out of spirits, have a chop-fallen appearance. After prolonged suffering the eyes become dull and lack expression, and are often slightly suffused with tears. The eyebrows not rarely are rendered oblique, which is due to their inner ends being raised. This produces peculiarly formed wrinkles on the forehead, which are very different from those of a simple frown, though in some cases a frown alone may be present. The corners of the mouth are drawn downwards, which is so universally recognized as a sign of being out of spirits that it is almost proverbial. The breathing becomes slow and feeble, and is often interrupted by deep sighs. As Gratiolet remarks, whenever our attention is being concentrated on any subject, we forget to breathe, and then relieve ourselves by a deep inspiration. But the sighs of a sorrowful person, owing to his slow respiration and languid circulation, are eminently characteristic. As the grief of a person in this state occasionally recurs and increases into a paroxysm, spasms affect the respiratory muscles, and he feels as if something, the so-called globus hystericus, was rising in his throat. These spasmodic movements are clearly allied to the sobbing of children, and are remnants of those severer spasms which occur when a person is said to choke from excessive grief. Obliquity of the eyebrows. 2 points alone in the above description require further elucidation, and these are very curious ones, namely, the raising of the inner ends of the eyebrows, and the drawing down of the corners of the mouth. With respect to the eyebrows, they may occasionally be seen to assume an oblique position in persons suffering from deep dejection or anxiety. For instance, I have observed this movement in a mother while speaking about her sick son, and it is sometimes excited by quite trifling or momentary causes of real or pretended distress. The eyebrows assume this position owing to the contraction of certain muscles, namely the orbiculars, corrugators, and pyramidals of the nose, which together tend to lower and contract the eyebrows, being partially checked by the more powerful action of the central fascia of the frontal muscle. These latter fascia, by their contraction, raise the inner ends alone of the eyebrows, and as the corrugators at the same time draw the eyebrows together, their inner ends become puckered into a fold or lump. This fold is a highly characteristic point in the appearance of the eyebrows when rendered oblique, as the eyebrows are at the same time somewhat roughened, owing to the hairs being made to project. Dr. J. Crichton-Browne has also often noticed in melancholic patients who keep their eyebrows persistently oblique, a peculiar acute arching of the upper eyelid. A trace of this may be observed by comparing the right and left eyelids of the young man in the photograph, for he was not able to act equally on both eyebrows. This is also shown by the unequal furrows on the two sides of his forehead. The acute arching of the eyelids depends, I believe, on the inner and alone of the eyebrows being raised, for when the whole eyebrow is elevated and arched, the upper eyelid follows in a slight degree the same movement. But the most conspicuous result of the opposed contraction of the above-named muscles is exhibited by the peculiar furrows formed on the forehead. These muscles, when thus in conjoint yet opposed action, may be called, for the sake of brevity, the grief muscles. When a person elevates his eyebrows by the contraction of the whole frontal muscle, transverse wrinkles extend across the whole breadth of the forehead. But in the present case, the middle fascia alone are contracted. Consequently, transverse furrows are formed across the middle part alone of the forehead. The skin over the exterior parts of both eyebrows is at the same time drawn downwards and smooth by the contraction of the outer portions of the orbicular muscles. The eyebrows are likewise brought together through the simultaneous contraction of the corrugators, and this latter action generates vertical furrows separating the exterior and lower part of the skin of the forehead from the central and raised part. The union of these vertical furrows with the central and transverse furrows produces a mark on the forehead which has been compared to a horseshoe, but the furrows more strictly form three sides of a quadrangle. They are often conspicuous on the foreheads of adult or nearly adult persons, when their eyebrows are made oblique, but with young children, owing to their skin not easily wrinkling, they are rarely seen, or mere traces of them can be detected. These peculiar furrows are best represented on the forehead of a young lady who has the power in an unusual degree of voluntarily acting on the requisite muscles. As she was absorbed in the attempt whilst being photographed, her expression was not at all one of grief. I have therefore given the forehead alone on the same plate, copied from Dr. Dejekson's work. Represents on a reduced scale the face, in its natural state, of a young man who was a good actor. He is shown simulating grief, but the two eyebrows, as before remarked, are not equally acted on. That the expression is true may be inferred from the fact that out of 15 persons to whom the original photograph was shown, without any clue to what was intended being given them, 14 immediately answered despairing sorrow, suffering endurance, melancholy, and so forth. The history of Figure 5 is rather curious. I saw the photograph in a shop window, and took it to Mr. Rijlander for the sake of finding out by whom it had been made. Remarking to him how pathetic the expression was, he answered, "I made it," and it was likely to be pathetic, for the boy in a few minutes burst out crying. He then showed me a photograph of the same boy in a placid state, which I have had reproduced. A trace of obliquity in the eyebrows may be detected, but this figure, as well as Figure 7, is given to show the depression of the corners of the mouth, to which subject I shall presently refer. Few persons without some practice can voluntarily act on their grief muscles, but after repeated trials a considerable number succeed, whilst others never can. The degree of obliquity in the eyebrows, whether assumed voluntarily or unconsciously, differs much in different persons. With some who apparently have unusually strong pyramidal muscles, the contraction of the central fascia of the frontal muscle, although it may be energetic, as shown by the quadrangular furrows on the forehead, does not raise the inner ends of the eyebrows, but only prevents their being so much lowered as they otherwise would have been. As far as I have been able to observe, the grief muscles are brought into action much more frequently by children and women than by men. They are rarely acted on, at least with grown-up persons, from bodily pain, but almost exclusively from mental distress. Two persons who, after some practice, succeeded in acting on their grief muscles, found by looking at a mirror that when they made their eyebrows oblique, they unintentionally, at the same time, depressed the corners of their mouths, and this is often the case when the expression is naturally assumed. The power to bring grief muscles freely into play appears to be hereditary, like almost every other human faculty. A lady belonging to a family famous for having produced an extraordinary number of great actors and actresses, and who can herself give this expression with singular precision, told Dr. Crichton-Browne that all her family had possessed the power in a remarkable degree. The same hereditary tendency is said to have extended, as I likewise hear from Dr. Browne, to the last descendant of the family, which gave rise to Sir Walter Scott's novel of Red Gauntlet, but the hero is described as contracting his forehead into a horseshoe mark from any strong emotion. I have also seen a young woman whose forehead seemed almost habitually thus contracted, independently of any emotion being at the time felt. The grief muscles are not very frequently brought into play, and as the action is often momentary, it easily escapes observation. Although the expression, when observed, is universally and instantly recognized as that of grief or anxiety, yet not one person out of 1,000, who had never studied the subject, is able to say precisely what change passes over the sufferer's face. Hence, probably, it is that this expression is not even alluded to, as far as I have noticed, in any work of fiction, with the exception of Red Gauntlet, and of one other novel; and the authoress of the latter, as I am informed, belongs to the famous family of actors just alluded to, so that her attention may have been specially called to the subject. The ancient Greek sculptors were familiar with the expression, as shown in the statues of the Laocoon and Aretino, but, as Dejection remarks, they carried the transverse furrows across the whole breadth of the forehead, and thus committed a great anatomical mistake. This is likewise the case in some modern statues. It is, however, more probable that these wonderfully accurate observers intentionally sacrificed truth for the sake of beauty, than that they made a mistake, for rectangular furrows on the forehead would not have had a grand appearance on the marble. The expression, in its fully developed condition, is, as far as I can discover, not often represented in pictures by the old masters, no doubt owing to the same cause, but a lady who is perfectly familiar with this expression informs me that in Fra Angelica's Descent from the Cross, in Florence, it is clearly exhibited in one of the figures on the right hand, and I could add a few other instances. Dr. Crichton-Browne, at my request, closely attended to this expression in the numerous insane patients under his care in the West Riding Asylum, and he is familiar with Duchenne's photographs of the action of the grief muscles. He informs me that they may constantly be seen in energetic action in cases of melancholia, and especially of hypochondria, and that the persistent lines or furrows due to their habitual contraction are characteristic of the physiognomy of the insane belonging to these two classes. Dr. Browne carefully observed for me, during a considerable period, 3 cases of hypochondria, in which the grief muscles were persistently contracted. In one of these, a widow, aged 51, fancied that she had lost all her viscera, and that her whole body was empty. She wore an expression of great distress, and beat her semi-closed hands rhythmically together for hours. The grief muscles were permanently contracted, and the upper eyelids arched. This condition lasted for months. She then recovered, and her countenance resumed its natural expression. A second case presented nearly the same peculiarities, with the addition that the corners of the mouth were depressed. Mr. Patrick Nicol has also kindly observed for me several cases in the Sussex Lunatic Asylum, and has communicated to me full details with respect to 3 of them, but they need not here be given. From his observations on melancholic patients, Mr. Nicol concludes that the inner ends of the eyebrows are almost always more or less raised, with the wrinkles on the forehead more or less plainly marked. In the case of one young woman, these wrinkles were observed to be in constant slight play or movement. In some cases the corners of the mouth are depressed, but often only in a slight degree. Some amount of difference in the expression of the several melancholic patients could almost always be observed. The eyelids generally droop, and the skin near the outer corners and beneath them is wrinkled. The nasolabial fold, which runs from the wings of the nostrils to the corners of the mouth, and which is so conspicuous in blubbering children, is often plainly marked in these patients. Although with the insane the grief muscles often act persistently, yet in ordinary cases they are sometimes brought unconsciously into momentary action by ludicrously slight causes. A gentleman rewarded a young lady by an absurdly small present. She pretended to be offended, and as she upbraided him, her eyebrows became extremely oblique, with the forehead properly wrinkled. Another young lady and a youth, both in the highest spirits, were eagerly talking together with extraordinary rapidity, and I noticed that, as often as the young lady was beaten and could not get out her words fast enough, her eyebrows went obliquely upwards, and rectangular furrows were formed on her forehead. She thus each time hoisted a flag of distress, and this she did half a dozen times in the course of a few minutes. I made no remark on the subject, but on a subsequent occasion I asked her to act on her grief muscles. Another girl who was present, and who could do so voluntarily, showing her what was intended, she tried repeatedly but utterly failed. Yet so slight a cause of distress as not being able to talk quickly enough sufficed to bring these muscles over and over again into energetic action. The expression of grief, due to the contraction of the grief muscles, is by no means confined to Europeans, but appears to be common to all the races of mankind. I have at least received trustworthy accounts in regard to Hindus, Dangars, one of the aboriginal hill tribes of India, and therefore belonging to a quite distinct race from the Hindus, Malays, Negroes, and Australians. With respect to the latter, 2 observers answer my query in the affirmative, but enter into no details. Mr. Taplin, however, appends to my descriptive remarks the words, "This is exact." With respect to Negroes, the lady who told me of Fra Angelico's picture saw a Negro towing a boat on the Nile, and as he encountered an obstruction, she observed his grief muscles in strong action, with the middle of the forehead well wrinkled. Mr. Geach watched a Malay man in Malacca, with the corners of his mouth much depressed, the eyebrows oblique, with deep short grooves on the forehead. This expression lasted for a very short time, and Mr. Geach remarks, "It was a strange one, very much like a person about to cry at some great loss." In India, Mr. H. Erskine found that the natives were familiar with this expression, and Mr. J. Scott of the Botanic Gardens, Calcutta, has obligingly sent me a full description of 2 cases. He observed during some time, himself unseen, a very young Dangar woman from Nagpur, the wife of one of the gardeners, nursing her baby who was at the point of death, and he distinctly saw the eyebrows raised at the inner corners, the eyelids drooping, the forehead wrinkled in the middle, the mouth slightly open, with the corners much depressed. He then came from behind a screen of plants and spoke to the poor woman, who started, burst into a bitter flood of tears, and besought him to cure her baby. The second case was that of a Hindustani man, who from illness and poverty was compelled to sell his favourite goat. After receiving the money, he repeatedly looked at the money in his hand and then at the goat, as if doubting whether he would not return it. He went to the goat, which was tied up ready to be led away, and the animal reared up and licked his hands. His eyes then wavered from side to side. His mouth was partially closed, with the corners very decidedly depressed. At last the poor man seemed to make up his mind that he must part with his goat, and then, as Mr. Scott saw, the eyebrows became slightly oblique, with the characteristic puckering or swelling at the inner ends, but the wrinkles on the forehead were not present. The man stood thus for a minute, then, heaving a deep sigh, burst into tears, raised up his 2 hands, blessed the goat, turned round, and, without looking again, went away. Section 14 of The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, Chapter 7, Low Spirits, Anxiety, Grief, Dejection, Despair, Part 2. On the cause of the obliquity of the eyebrows under suffering. During several years no expression seemed to me so utterly perplexing as this which we are here considering. Why should grief or anxiety cause the central fascia alone in the frontal muscle, together with those round the eyes, to contract? Here we seem to have a complex movement for the sole purpose of expressing grief. And yet it is a comparatively rare expression, and often overlooked. I believe the explanation is not so difficult as it at first appears. Dr. Duchesne gives a photograph of the young man before referred to, who, when looking upwards at a strongly illuminated surface, involuntarily contracted his grief muscles in an exaggerated manner. I had entirely forgotten this photograph, when on a very bright day with the sun behind me, I met, whilst on horseback, a girl whose eyebrows, as she looked up at me, became extremely oblique, with the proper furrows on her forehead. I have observed the same movement under similar circumstances on several subsequent occasions. On my return home I made 3 of my children, without giving them any clue to my object, look as long and as attentively as they could, at the summit of a tall tree standing against an extremely bright sky. With all 3, the orbicular, corrugator, and pyramidal muscles were energetically contracted, through reflex action, from the excitement of the retina, so that their eyes might be protected from the bright light. But they tried their utmost to look upwards, and now a curious struggle, with spasmodic twitchings, could be observed between the whole, or only the central portion of the frontal muscle, and the several muscles which serve to lower the eyebrows and close the eyelids. The involuntary contraction of the pyramidal caused the basal part of their noses to be transversely and deeply wrinkled. In one of the 3 children, the whole eyebrows were momentarily raised and lowered by the alternate contraction of the whole frontal muscle, and of the muscles surrounding the eyes, so that the whole breadth of the forehead was alternately wrinkled and smoothed. In the other 2 children, the forehead became wrinkled in the middle part alone, rectangular furrows being thus produced, and the eyebrows were rendered oblique, with their inner extremities puckered and swollen. In the one child in a slight degree, in the other in a strongly marked manner. This difference in the obliquity of the eyebrows apparently depended on a difference in their general mobility, and in the strength of the pyramidal muscles. In both these cases the eyebrows and forehead were acted on under the influence of a strong light, in precisely the same manner, in every characteristic detail, as under the influence of grief or anxiety. Duchenne states that the pyramidal muscle of the nose is less under the control of the will than are the other muscles round the eyes. He remarks that the young man who could so well act on his grief muscles as well as on most of his other facial muscles could not contract the pyramidals. This power, however, no doubt differs in different persons. The pyramidal muscle serves to draw down the skin of the forehead between the eyebrows, together with their inner extremities. The central fascia of the frontal are the antagonists of the pyramidal, and if the action of the latter is to be specially checked, these central fascia must be contracted. So that with persons having powerful pyramidal muscles, if there is under the influence of a bright light an unconscious desire to prevent the lowering of the eyebrows, the central fascia of the frontal muscle must be brought into play, and their contraction, if sufficiently strong to overmaster the pyramidals, together with the contraction of the corrugator and orbicular muscles, will act in the manner just described on the eyebrows and forehead. When children scream or cry out, they contract, as we know, the orbicular, corrugator, and pyramidal muscles, primarily for the sake of compressing their eyes and thus protecting them from being gorged with blood, and secondarily through habit. I therefore expected to find with children that when they endeavored either to prevent a crying fit from coming on, or to stop crying, they would cheek the contraction of the above-named muscles, in the same manner as when looking upwards at a bright light, and consequently that the central fascia of the frontal muscle would often be brought into play. Accordingly, I began myself to observe children at such times, and asked others, including some medical men, to do the same. It is necessary to observe carefully, as the peculiar opposed action of these muscles is not nearly so plain in children, owing to their foreheads not easily wrinkling, as in adults. But I soon found that the grief muscles were very frequently brought into distinct action on these occasions. It would be superfluous to give all the cases which have been observed, and I will specify only a few. A little girl, a year and a half old, was teased by some other children, and before bursting into tears, her eyebrows became decidedly oblique. With an older girl the same obliquity was observed, with the inner ends of the eyebrows plainly puckered, and at the same time the corners of the mouth were drawn downwards. As soon as she burst into tears, the features all changed, and this peculiar expression vanished again after a little boy had been vaccinated, which made him scream and cry violently. The surgeon gave him an orange brought for the purpose, and this pleased the child much. As he stopped crying, all the characteristic movements were observed, including the formation of rectangular wrinkles in the middle of the forehead. Lastly, I met on the road a little girl 3 or 4 years old, who had been frightened by a dog, and when I asked her what was the matter, she stopped whimpering, and her eyebrows instantly became oblique to an extraordinary degree. Here then, as I cannot doubt, we have the key to the problem why the central fascia of the frontal muscle and the muscles round the eyes contract in opposition to each other under the influence of grief. Whether their contraction be prolonged, as with the melancholic insane, or momentary, from some trifling cause of distress. We have all of us, as infants, repeatedly contracted our orbicular, corrugator, and pyramidal muscles, in order to protect our eyes whilst screaming. Our progenitors before us have done the same during many generations, and though with advancing years we easily prevent, when feeling distressed, the utterance of screams, we cannot from long habit always prevent a slight contraction of the above-named muscles, nor indeed do we observe their contraction in ourselves, or attempt to stop it, if slight. But the pyramidal muscles seem to be less under the command of the will than the other related muscles, and if they be well developed, their contraction can be checked only by the antagonistic contraction of the central fascia of the frontal muscle. The result which necessarily follows, if these fascia contract energetically, is the oblique drawing up of the eyebrows, the puckering of their inner ends, and the formation of rectangular furrows on the middle of the forehead. As children and women cry much more freely than men, and as grown-up persons of both sexes rarely weep except from mental distress, we can understand why the grief muscles are more frequently seen in action, as I believe to be the case with children and women than with men, and with adults of both sexes from mental distress alone. In some of the cases before recorded, as in that of the poor Dangar woman and of the Hindustani man, the action of the grief muscles was quickly followed by bitter weeping. In all cases of distress, whether great or small, our brains tend, through long habit, to send an order to certain muscles to contract, as if we were still infants on the point of screaming out. But this order we, by the wondrous power of the will, and through habit, are able partially to counteract, although this is effected unconsciously, as far as the means of counteraction are concerned. On the depression of the corners of the mouth, this action is effected by the depressores anguli oris. The fibers of this muscle diverge downwards, with the upper convergent ends attached round the angles of the mouth and to the lower lip a little way within the angles. Some of the fibers appear to be antagonistic to the great zygomatic muscle, and others to the several muscles running to the outer part of the upper lip. The contraction of this muscle draws downwards and outwards the corners of the mouth, including the outer part of the upper lip, and even in a slight degree the wings of the nostrils. When the mouth is closed and this muscle acts, the commissure or line of junction of the two lips forms a curved line with the concavity downwards, and the lips themselves are generally somewhat protruded, especially the lower one. The mouth in this state is well represented in the two photographs by Mr. Reislander. The upper boy had just stopped crying, after receiving a slap on the face from another boy, and the right moment was seized for photographing him. The expression of low spirits, grief, or dejection, due to the contraction of this muscle, has been noticed by everyone who has written on the subject. To say that a person is down in the mouth is synonymous with saying that he is out of spirits. The depression of the corners may often be seen, as already stated on the authority of Dr. Crichton-Browne and Mr. Nicol, with the melancholic insane, and was well exhibited in some photographs sent to me by the former gentleman, of patients with a strong tendency to suicide. It has been observed with men belonging to various races, namely, with Hindus, the dark hill tribes of India, Malays, and, as the Reverend Mr. Hagenauer informs me, with the aborigines of Australia. When infants scream, they firmly contract the muscles round their eyes, and this draws up the upper lip, and as they have to keep their mouths widely open, the depressor muscles running to the corners are likewise brought into strong action. This generally, but not invariably, causes a slight angular bend in the lower lip on both sides, near the corners of the mouth. The result of the upper and lower lip being thus acted on is that the mouth assumes a squarish outline. The contraction of the depressor muscle is best seen in infants who are not screaming violently, and especially just before they begin, or when they cease to scream. Their little faces then acquire an extremely piteous expression, as I continually observed with my own infants between the ages of about 6 weeks and 2 or 3 months. Sometimes, when they are struggling against a crying fit, the outline of the mouth is curved in so exaggerated a manner as to be like a horseshoe, and the expression of misery then becomes a ludicrous caricature. The explanation of the contraction of this muscle under the influence of low spirits or dejection apparently follows from the same general principles as in the case of the obliquity of the eyebrows. Dr. Duchesne informs me that he concludes from his observations, now prolonged during many years, that this is one of the facial muscles which is least under the control of the will. This fact may indeed be inferred from what has just been stated with respect to infants, when doubtfully beginning to cry, or endeavouring to stop crying, for they then generally command all. This fact may indeed be inferred from what has just been stated with respect to infants, when doubtfully beginning to cry, or endeavouring to stop crying, for they then generally command all the other facial muscles more effectually than they do the depressors of the corners of the mouth. Two excellent observers who had no theory on the subject, one of them a surgeon, carefully watched for me some older children and women, as with some opposed struggling, they very gradually approached the point of bursting out into tears, and both observers felt sure that the depressors began to act before any of the other muscles. Now, as the depressors have been repeatedly brought into strong action during infancy and many generations, nerve force will tend to flow, on the principle of long associated habit, to these muscles as well as to various other facial muscles. Whenever in after life even a slight feeling of distress is experienced. But as the depressors are somewhat less under the control of the will than most of the other muscles, we might expect that they would often slightly contract, whilst the others remain passive. It is remarkable how small a depression of the corners of the mouth gives to the countenance an expression of low spirits or dejection, so that an extremely slight contraction of these muscles would be sufficient to betray this state of mind. I may here mention a trifling observation, as it will serve to sum up our present subject. An old lady with a comfortable but absorbed expression sat nearly opposite to me in a railway carriage. Whilst I was looking at her, I saw that her depressors angularly oris became very slightly, yet decidedly, contracted, but as her countenance remained as placid as ever, I reflected how meaningless was this contraction, and how easily one might be deceived. The thought had hardly occurred to me when I saw that her eyes suddenly became suffused with tears almost to overflowing, and her whole countenance fell. There could now be no doubt that some painful recollection, perhaps that of a long-lost child, was passing through her mind. As soon as her sensorium was thus affected, certain nerve cells from long habit instantly transmitted an order to all the respiratory muscles, and to those round the mouth, to prepare for a fit of crying, but the order was countermanded by the will, or rather by a later acquired habit, and all the muscles were obedient, excepting in a slight degree the depressores anguli oris. The mouth was not even opened, the respiration was not hurried, and no muscle was affected except those which draw down the corners of the mouth. As soon as the mouth of this lady began, involuntarily and unconsciously on her part, to assume the proper form for a crying fit, we may feel almost sure that some nerve influence would have been transmitted through the long accustomed channels to the various respiratory muscles, as well as to those round the eyes, and to the vasomotor centre which governs the supply of blood sent to the lachrymal glands. Of this latter fact we have indeed clear evidence in her eyes becoming slightly suffused with tears, and we can understand this, as the lachrymal glands are less under the control of the will than the facial muscles. No doubt there existed at the same time some tendency in the muscles round the eyes at contract, as if for the sake of protecting them from being gorged with blood. But this contraction was completely overmastered, and her brow remained unruffled. Had the pyramidal, corrugator, and orbicular muscles been as little obedient to the will as they are in many persons, they would have been slightly acted on. And then the central fascia of the frontal muscle would have contracted in antagonism, and her eyebrows would have become oblique with rectangular furrows on her forehead. Her countenance would then have expressed still more plainly than it did a state of dejection, or rather one of grief. Through steps such as these we can understand how it is that as soon as some melancholy thought passes through the brain, there occurs a just perceptible drawing down at the corners of the mouth, or a slight raising up of the inner ends of the eyebrows, or both movements combined, and immediately afterwards a slight suffusion of tears. A thrill of nerve force is transmitted along several habitual channels, and produces an effect on any point where the will has not acquired through long habit much power of interference. The above actions may be considered as rudimental vestiges of the screaming fits, which are so frequent and prolonged during infancy. In this case, as well as in many others, the links are indeed wonderful which connect cause and effect, in giving rise to various expressions on the human countenance, and they explain to us the meaning of certain movements which we involuntarily and unconsciously perform, whenever certain transitory emotions pass through our minds. End of section 14.
Section 15 of the expression of the emotions in man and animals. Chapter 8, Joy, High Spirits, Love, Tender Feelings, Devotion, Part 1. Laughter primarily the expression of joy, ludicrous ideas, movement of the features during laughter, nature of the sound produced, the secretions of tears during loud laughter, gradations from loud laughter to gentle smiling, high spirits, the expression of love, tender feelings, devotion. Joy, when intense, leads to various purposeless movements, to dancing about, clapping the hands, stamping, and to loud laughter. Laughter seems primarily to be the expression of mere joy or happiness. We clearly see this in children at play, who are almost incessantly laughing. With young persons past childhood, when they are in high spirits, there is always much meaningless laughter. The laughter of the gods is described by Homer as the exuberance of their celestial joy after their daily banquet. A man smiles, and smiling, as we shall see, graduates into laughter, at meeting an old friend in the street, as he does at any trifling pleasure, such as smelling a sweet perfume. Laura Brickman, from her blindness and deafness, could not have acquired any expression through imitation. Yet, when a letter from a beloved friend was communicated to her by gesture language, she laughed and clapped her hands, and the color mounted to her cheeks. On other occasions, she has been seen to stamp for joy. Idiots and imbecile persons likewise afford good evidence that laughter or smiling primarily expresses mere happiness or joy. Dr. Crichton-Browne, to whom, as on so many other occasions, I am indebted for the results of his wide experience, informs me that with idiots, laughter is the most prevalent and frequent of all the emotional expressions. Many idiots are morose, passionate, restless, in a painful state of mind, or utterly stolid, and these never laugh. Others frequently laugh in a quite senseless manner. Thus, an idiot boy, incapable of speech, complained to Dr. Browne, by the aid of signs, that another boy in the asylum had given him a black eye, and this was accompanied by explosions of laughter, and with his face covered with the broadest smiles. There is another class of idiots who are persistently joyous and benign, and who are constantly laughing or smiling. Their countenances often exhibit a stereotyped smile. Their joyousness is increased, and they grin, chuckle, or giggle whenever food is placed before them, or when they are caressed, are shown bright colors, or hear music. Some of them laugh more than usual when they walk about, or attempt any muscular exertion. The joyousness of most of these idiots cannot possibly be associated, as Dr. Browne remarks, with any distinct ideas. They simply feel pleasure and express it by laughter or smiles. With imbeciles rather higher in the scale, personal vanity seems to be the commonest cause of laughter, and next to this, pleasure arising from the approbation of their conduct. With grown-up persons, laughter is excited by causes considerably different from those which suffice during childhood, but this remark hardly applies to smiling. Laughter in this respect is analogous with weeping, which with adults is almost confined to mental distress, while with children it is excited by bodily pain or any suffering, as well as by fear or rage. Many curious discussions have been written on the causes of laughter with grown-up persons. The subject is extremely complex. Something incongruous or unaccountable, exciting surprise and some sense of superiority in the laughter, who must be in a happy frame of mind, seems to be the commonest cause. The circumstances must not be of a momentous nature. No poor man would laugh or smile on suddenly hearing that a large fortune had been bequeathed to him. If the mind is strongly excited by pleasurable feelings, and any little unexpected event or thought occurs, then, as Mr. Herbert Spencer remarks, a large amount of nervous energy, instead of being allowed to expend itself in producing an equivalent amount of the new thoughts and emotion which were nascent, is suddenly checked in its flow. The excess must discharge itself in some other direction, and there results an efflux through the motor nerves to various classes of the muscles, producing the half-convulsive actions we term laughter. An observation bearing on this point was made by a correspondent during the recent siege of Paris, namely, that the German soldiers, after strong excitement from exposure to extreme danger, were particularly apt to burst out into loud laughter at the smallest joke. So again, when young children are just beginning to cry, an unexpected event will sometimes suddenly turn their crying into laughter, which apparently serves equally well to expend their superflux nervous energy. The imagination is sometimes said to be tickled by a ludicrous idea, and this so-called tickling of the mind is curiously analogous with that of the body. Everyone knows how immoderate children laugh, and how their whole bodies are convulsed when they are tickled. The anthropoid apes, as we have seen, likewise utter a reiterated sound corresponding with our laughter when they are tickled, especially under the armpits. I touched with a bit of paper the sole of the foot of one of my infants when only 7 days old, and it was suddenly jerked away and the toes curled about, as in an older child. Such movements, as well as laughter from being tickled, are manifestly reflex actions, and this is likewise shown by the minute unstriped muscles, which serve to erect the separate hairs on the body, contracting near a tickled surface. Yet, laughter from ludicrous idea, though involuntary, cannot be called a strictly reflex action. In this case, and in that of laughter from being tickled, the mind must be in a pleasurable condition. A young child, if tickled by a strange man, would scream from fear. The touch must be light, and an idea or event to be ludicrous must not be of grave import. The parts of the body which are most easily tickled are those which are not commonly touched, such as the armpits, or between the toes, or parts such as the soles of the feet, which are habitually touched by a broad surface, but the surface on which we sit offers a marked exception to this rule. According to Gratiolet, certain nerves are much more sensitive to tickling than others. From the fact that a child can hardly tickle itself, or in a much less degree than when tickled by another person, It seems that the precise point to be touched must not be known. So with the mind, something unexpected, a novel or incongruous idea which breaks through an habitual train of thought, appears to be a strong element in the ludicrous. The sound of laughter is produced by a deep inspiration followed by short, interrupted, spasmodic contractions of the chest, and especially the diaphragm. Hence, we hear of laughter holding both his sides. From the shaking of the body, the head nods to and fro. The lower jaw often quivers up and down, as is likewise the case with some species of baboons when they are much pleased. The tendency in the zygomatic muscles to contract under pleasurable emotions is shown by a curious fact communicated to me by Dr. Browne with respect to patients suffering from general paralysis of the insane. In this malady, there is almost invariably optimism, delusions as to wealth, rank, grandeur, insane joyousness, benevolence, and profusion, while its very earliest physical symptom is trembling at the corners of the mouth and at the outer corners of the eyes. This is a well-recognized fact. Constant tremulous agitation of the inferior palpebral and great zygomatic muscles is pathognomic of the earlier stages of general paralysis. The countenance has a pleased and benevolent expression. As the disease advances, other muscles become involved, but until complete fatuity is reached, the prevailing expression is that of feeble benevolence. As in laughing and broadly smiling, the cheeks and upper lip are much raised, the nose appears to be shortened, and the skin on the bridge becomes finely wrinkled in transverse lines, with other oblique longitudinal lines on the sides. The upper front teeth are commonly exposed. A well-marked nasolabial fold is formed, which runs from the wing of each nostril to the corner of the mouth, and this fold is often double in old persons. A bright and sparkling eye is as characteristic of a pleased or amused state of mind as is the retraction of the corners of the mouth and upper lip with the wrinkles thus produced. Even the eyes of microcephalous idiots who are so degraded that they never learn to speak brighten slightly when they are pleased. Under extreme laughter, the eyes are too much suffused with tears to sparkle, but the moisture squeezed out of the glands during moderate laughter or smiling may aid in giving them luster, though this must be of altogether subordinate importance, as they become dull from grief, though they are then often moist. Their brightness seems to be chiefly due to their tenseness, owing to the contraction of the orbicular muscles and to the pressure of the raised cheeks. But according to Dr. Pederick, who has discussed this point more fully than any other writer, the tenseness may be largely attributed to the eyeballs becoming filled with blood and other fluids from the acceleration of the circulation consequent on the excitement of pleasure. He remarks on the contrast in the appearance of the eyes of a hectic patient with a rapid circulation and of a man suffering from cholera with almost all the fluids of his body drained from him. Any cause which lowers the circulation deadens the eye. I remember seeing a man utterly prostrated by prolonged and severe exertion during a very hot day, and a bystander compared his eyes to those of a boiled codfish. To return to the sounds produced during laughter, we can see in a vague manner how the utterance of sounds of some kind would naturally become associated with a pleasurable state of mind. For throughout a large part of the animal kingdom, vocal or instrumental sounds are employed either as a call or as a charm by one sex for the other. They are also employed as the means for a joyful meeting between the parents and their offspring, and between the attached members of the same social community. But why the sounds which man utters when he is pleased have the peculiar reiterated character of laughter we do not know. Nevertheless, we can see that they would naturally be as different as possible from the screams or cries of distress. And as in the production of the later, the expirations are prolonged and continuous, with the inspirations short and interrupted, so it might perhaps have been expected, with the sounds uttered from joy, that the expirations would have been short and broken, with the inspirations prolonged, and this is the case. It is an equally obscure point why the corners of the mouth are retracted and the upper lip raised during ordinary laughter. The mouth must not be open to its utmost extent, for when this occurs during a paroxysm of excessive laughter, hardly any sound is emitted, or it changes its tone and seems to come from deep down in the throat. The respiratory muscles, and even those of the limbs, are at the same time thrown into rapid vibratory movements. The lower jaw often partakes of this movement, and this would tend to prevent the mouth from being widely opened. But as a full volume of sound has to be poured forth, the orifice of the mouth must be large, and it is perhaps to gain this end that the corners are retracted and the upper lip raised. Although we can hardly account for the shape of the mouth during laughter, which leads to wrinkles being formed beneath the eyes, nor for the peculiar reiterated sound of laughter, nor for the quivering of the jaws, nevertheless, we may infer that all these effects are due to some common cause, for they are all characteristics and expressive of a pleased state of mind in various kinds of monkeys. A graduated series can be followed from violent to moderate laughter, to a broad smile, to a gentle smile, and to the expression of mere cheerfulness. During excessive laughter, the whole body is often thrown backward and shakes, or is almost convulsed. The respiration is much disturbed. The head and face become gorged with blood, with the veins distended, and the orbicular muscles are spasmodically contracted in order to protect the eyes. Tears are freely shed. Hence, as formerly remarked, it is scarcely possible to point out any difference between the tear-stained face of a person after a paroxysm of excessive laughter and after a bitter crying fit. It is probably due to the close similarity of the spasmodic movements caused by these widely different emotions that hysteric patients alternately cry and laugh with violence, and that young children sometimes pass suddenly from the one to the other state. Mr. Swingho informs me that he has often seen the Chinese, when suffering from deep grief, burst out into hysterical fits of laughter. I was anxious to know whether tears are freely shed during excessive laughter by most of the races of men, and I hear from my correspondents that this is the case. One instance was observed with the Hindus, and they themselves said that it often occurred. So it is with the Chinese. The women of the wild tribe of Malays in Malacca Peninsula sometimes shed tears when they laugh heartily, though this seldom occurs. With the Dyaks of Borneo, it must frequently be the case, at least with the women, for I hear from the Raja Sea Brook that it is a common expression with them to say, "We nearly make tears from laughter." The aborigines of Australia express their emotions freely, and they are described by my correspondents as jumping about and clapping their hands for joy, and as often roaring with laughter. No less than 4 observers have seen their eyes freely watering on such occasions, and in one instance the tears rolled down their cheeks. Mr. Bulmer, a missionary in a remote part of Victoria, remarks that they have a keen sense of the ridiculous. They are excellent mimics, and when one of them is able to imitate the peculiarities of some absent member of the tribe, it is very common to hear all in the camp convulse with laughter. With Europeans, hardly anything excites laughter so easily as mimicry, and it is rather curious to find the same fact with the savages of Australia, who constitute one of the most distinct races in the world. In southern Africa, with the 2 tribes of Kafirs, especially with the women, their eyes often fill with tears during laughter. Gaika, the brother of the chief Sandili, answered my query on this bead with the words, "Yes, that is their common practice." Sir Andrew Smith has seen the painted face of a Hottentot woman all furrowed with tears after a fit of laughter. In northern Africa, with the Abyssinians, tears are secreted under the same circumstances. Lastly, in North America, The same fact has been observed in a remarkably savage and isolated tribe, but chiefly with the women. In another tribe it was observed only on a single occasion. Excessive laughter, as before remarked, graduate into moderate laughter. In this later case, the muscles round the eyes are much less contracted, and there is little or no frowning. Between a gentle laugh and a broad smile, there is hardly any difference, excepting that, in smiling, no reiterated sound is uttered, though a single rather strong expiration or slight noise, a rudiment of a laugh, may often be heard at the commencement of a smile. On a moderately smiling countenance, the contraction of the upper orbicular muscles can still just be traced by a slight lowering of the eyebrows. The contraction of the lower orbicular and palpebral muscles is much plainer, and is shown by the wrinkling of the lower eyelids and of the skin beneath them, together with a slight drawing up of the upper lip. From the broadest smile we pass by the finest steps into the gentlest one. In this later case, the features are moved in a much less degree and much more slowly, and the mouth is kept closed. The curvature of the nasolabial furrow is also slightly different in the two cases. We thus see that no abrupt line of demarcation can be drawn between the movement of the features during the most violent laughter and a very faint smile. A smile, therefore, may be said to be the first stage in the development of a laugh, but a different and more probable view may be suggested, namely, that the habit of uttering low reiterated sounds from a sense of pleasure first led to the retraction of the corners of the mouth and of the upper lip, and to the contraction of the orbicular muscles, and that now, through association and long-continued habit, the same muscles are brought into slight play whenever any cause excites in us a feeling which, if stronger, would have led to laughter, and the result is a smile. Whether we look at laughter as the full development of a smile, or, as is more probable, at the gentle smile as the last trace of a habit, firmly fixed during many generations, of laughing whenever we are joyful, we can follow in our infants the gradual passage of the one into the other. It is well known to those who have the charge of young infants that it is difficult to feel sure when certain movements about their mouths are really expressive, that is, when they really smile. Hence, I carefully watched my own infants, one of them at the age of 45 days, and being at the time in a happy frame of mind, smiled, that is, the corners of the mouth were retracted, and simultaneously the eyes became decidedly bright. I observed the same thing on the following day, but on the third day the child was not quite well, and there was no trace of a smile, and this renders it probable that the previous smiles were real. 8 days subsequently, and during the next succeeding week, it was remarkable how his eyes brightened whenever he smiled, and his nose became at the same time transversely wrinkled. This was now accompanied by a little bleating noise, which perhaps represented a laugh. At the age of 113 days, these little noises, which were always made during expiration, assume a slightly different character, and were more broken and interrupted, as in sobbing, and this was certainly incipient laughter. The change in tone seemed to me at the time to be connected with the greater lateral extension of the mouth, as the smiles became broader. In a second infant, the first real smile was observed at about the same age, viz. 45 days, and in a third at a somewhat earlier age. The second infant, when 65 days old, smiled much more broadly and plainly than did the one first mentioned at the same age, and even at this early age uttered noises very like laughter. In this gradual acquirement by infants of the habit of laughing, we have a case in some degree analogous to that of weeping. As practice is requisite with the ordinary movements of the body, such as walking, so it seems to be with laughing and weeping. The art of screaming, on the other hand, from being of service to infants, has become finely developed from the earliest days. End of section 15.